I'm delighted to be here, and I'm going to make sure you can hear me, and I'm going to stand up so you can see me. All right? All right. We're all here as part of the Ashby Village community. And you know, I was thinking there are many things that make aging a challenge, and physically, but there are two very good things about it. One we share, I think, with other aging people, and one thing we have in common here. I think as we get older, we learn something, you know? We get a little wiser and a little more perspective. So that's the thing we share with everyone. But those who have been touched by the 1960s and who have, in a sense, experienced what it's like to be part of a social movement, whether it's an anti-war movement or a civil rights movement, a feminist movement, environmental movement, any of those movements that marked that decade and the one to follow, gave us a sense, actually, you can get together and do something. And I think in this way, it is truly a golden age. So I'm delighted to be here with you, with my own gray hair. So, you know, I'd like to say that we need what we've got here today, because as Joni was saying, we are in a way in a struggle for the soul of our country. And we need to figure out exactly what got us here and what to do about it, using an experience of the 60s. So I'd like to share with you a journey that I began 6 years ago. And it all began with a moment in my office in the sociology department at UC Berkeley. And I thought, you know, all the things that I have called for in my life, you know, starting with parental leave and state-of-the-art childcare and, you know, flexible workplace, many of these things aren't going to come to pass as long as there is a big stone in the road, as long as there is in Congress a big clash, a big standstill, as long as there is a movement on the right that wants to stop all this. So I figured, you know, I've got to just turn around and find out who, quote, these people, when I began, it was, quote, these people, are. And because I've found myself in a world in which already 6 years ago, the sides were getting more and more divided and more extreme, and there was shouting across. And I thought, well, how am I going to find out what the other side thinks? I have to get out of my enclave, my geographic enclave, my Berkeley, California, my media enclave, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and my electronic enclave. I would look at my computer and it would surround me with myself, as it does. I'd like to find an enclave that is as far right as Berkeley, California is left. Where would that be? Well, that would be in the South, because that's where the right has grown the fastest and the strongest. Okay, but where in the South? I looked at the 2012 returns, looking at the proportion of whites who voted for the re-election of Barack Obama. For California, it was about half. For the whole region of the South, it was a third of whites voting for the re-election of Barack Obama. In Louisiana, it was 14% of whites voting for Obama. So I thought, perfect. Who among them? Well, these would be whites, older, religious if possible. That was who I wanted to get to know. As luck would have it, I knew one person in the state of Louisiana who happened to be the mother-in-law of a former graduate student of mine. And the graduate student and his wife and new child were visiting one Sunday. Excuse me. And they asked me politely, "What's your next project?" And I said, "You know, I really want to understand the growing right wing in this country, and I don't know quite how I'm going to do it. But I'm interested in the emotional understructure of their beliefs and commitments." So the wife of my student said, "If you're interested in the right wing, you have to come to Lake Charles, Louisiana." And I thought, well, thank you very much. Very nice offer. And then I went to bed and woke up the next morning and thought, Lake Charles, Louisiana? Wow, okay. This mother was a progressive Democrat, an artist, very wonderful art-filled house, and her best friend was an ardent member of the Tea Party. They had gone to a Louisiana State University together, a sorority together. They had keys to each other's houses. Their children loved each other. They went to cultural events together and were lifelong friends. When there was a disagreement between them, the Tea Party woman consulted the mother of my progressive contact and friend, and to help them stop fussing, is how I think they talk. So I took a plane trip to Lake Charles, Louisiana, thinking this wouldn't last, this wouldn't be, I'll just get a taster here and see what people sound like. But in doing this, I should say, I wanted to take my own moral and political alarm system off and permit myself a lot of curiosity about the people I was coming to meet. And, you know, already I learned something. Even before I set off for the airport, people would say, when I said what I was doing, a neighbor said, "Oh, I couldn't do that. I'd be so angry all the time." Man, these people, that's going to be hard. And another kind of response I got was interesting, where people would say, "You're going where? To do what?" And then there wouldn't be any statement, but there would be kind of an expression as if to say, if you're going to the heartland of the right, maybe you're not as left as you look like, you know. Oh. So I find a basic, important, missing idea in both of those responses. And the basic, important idea underlying both responses is that you can't remain exactly who you are with your own commitments and truly cross what I came to think of as an empathy bridge to not just step into the shoes, but try and really understand the heart of another group of people. And I felt you could do that. I know we can do that. So I began with the red state paradox as my secret question. Incidentally, it wasn't actually secret, and I was never secret about my own political affiliation. I'm an open book. You can just Google, and you'll find a lot of my beliefs. And I would say, where I was from and why I was doing this. And people would say in response, I would say, look, I'm just worried about this big divide, and I live in one political bubble and you live in another. And I'm really worried about it. Can I come and find out about you and get to know you? And their first response was, we're worried about the divide too. Thanks for coming. People think we're the flyover state. They assume we're racist and backward, and thanks, come on. Hey, do you want to come to church with me? So very invitational in this way. But I started with the red state paradox. How could it be that the poorest states, the states with the worst education, Louisiana has the nation's worst education, the worst medical care, the worst health, the most accidents, the most disrupted families, the lowest life expectancy, are also those states that receive more money from the federal government in aid than they give to it in tax dollars, and are universally more conservative and suspicious of the federal government. Didn't understand that. And Louisiana, when I got closer to it, was an exaggerated version of the red state paradox, because it was second poorest state in the country. 44% of the state budget came from the federal government. And they were overwhelmingly Tea Party and went enthusiastically for Donald Trump, both primary and final vote. So that didn't make sense. And so that was the question I kept with me. I carried it around like a backpack. How could this be? And then I woke up at the little B&B where I stayed, Aunt Ruby's B&B, and in Lake Charles, and got in my car and crossed over what's called the I-10 bridge into Westlake, which is the center, really, of the American petrochemical industry, recently very expanded. And they proudly call it the buckle in America's energy belt. And my eyes began to sting. And then I noticed that actually Lake Charles, nobody was swimming in it. And then I noticed everyone had plastic bottles. Of course, we do too, but nobody was drinking the water. And the sky looked kind of unclear on some days. Often the releases are in the evening or early evening. And right now, if you Google it, you go home and Google Sasol, which is a South Africa-based plant. All of these plants are based somewhere else. These are multinationals. They pollute Louisiana, but they live and are based somewhere else, and they're highly automated. Okay, so this was the industry here, and this was the consequence of it. But how could people be against regulating the polluters if they were suffering from pollution like this? So that became, in a way, the epicenter of my red state paradox. And so I set off on this journey, and in the end had interviewed 60 people, 40 of whom were ardent Tea Party supporters, whom I met in a variety of ways. I I went to meetings of the Republican Women of Southwest Louisiana, and followed two Republican and Tea Party candidates for the Congress, National Congress. So that took me to boat parades and Miss Rice festivals and union meet and greets. And I would just come, for that kind of contact, which is brief, I would just say, hi, I'm Arlie Hochschild, and I, come from a democratic state, and I'm just kind of curious how things work. And people, again, would say, well, here's this lady come from California, interested in us. Why don't you sit down here, and I'll get my union buddies here and talk to you. So that was another way. I also, when I was keying in on the environment, followed a man around who was an environmentalist, and he said, oh, I have a lot of friends and neighbors who hate what I do. And I said, ooh, ooh, could I follow you around and meet the people who hate what you do? Yeah, sure. So over time, and I did focus groups and did what we call snowballing. You interview, let's say, a wife and her husband, their children, the grandparents, the neighbors. You snowball around. Okay. So what was this adding up to? I wanted to know how you could sustain this much distrust of government. And I'll give you a person who begins the book as an example of how I tried to unpack the answer to that question. He was, and I asked him, hey, can I see where you were born? Can I see the hospital, is it, and the church you went to, and where your parents were buried, and where else you may have lived, and maybe your workplace? And he said, sure. And to take me to where he was born, he got his red truck, which is near Donaldsonville, which is in southeastern Louisiana. Louisiana's a boot, so it's closer to the front of the boot. And it's near the lower languid kind of channeling of the Mississippi River, which is now called Cancer Alley. Because where the old plantations were, there are now petrochemical plants, Monsanto, Dow Chemical, Sasol, Citgo. And so actually these companies have bought up those plantations and have a lot of their annual meetings in the big house of these plantations. And in truth, oil is the new plantation system in the state of Louisiana. But Mike, his name is Mike, said, okay, you want to see where I was born? Got me in his red truck. And we went to this sugarcane field, which itself used to be a plantation. And the sugarcane was huge, 6 or 7 feet high. And we were driving in the middle on a red earth road right through an enormous field of sugar. And I'm looking for a house. Well, there is no house. What there is the memory of a house. He was Cajun. He was the son of 5th out of 7 kids who were children of the plumber who used to service the workers on this plantation in the 60s, and 70s. And half of his job was to service other homes outside that plantation. So he was showing me kind of where a beloved community used to be, where his, everybody had a funny name. Uncle Pook, had his workshop here, and his aunt there, his grandparents, and finally he pointed to some more sugar, because we're just in this, there's only sugar. And so that's where I used to live, in a shotgun house, a house you could shoot through. We didn't know we were poor. It was a wonderful childhood. And so this was his childhood in the Old South. And his adulthood was in the New South. He had worked for oil all of his life. And then something happened that turned him into an environmentalist and goes to the very heart of this red state paradox. He told me that the reason he didn't like big government, first reason, there are four, but first reason, was that it took community away, such as he once had as a boy. That in comes the government, and it does for people what people should do for each other. And so big bad government, it's replacing valuable community as he saw it. But something happened where something else took this man's community away. He lived as an adult in a place called Bayou Corn. Does that ring a bell with anyone? Okay. Bayou Corn. And one day in 2012, you could hear a lot of noise, suddenly noise. A woman said it looked like there was a big dumpster that was just crashed down on the pavement somewhere. Big noise she'd never heard before. And then people began to see rumbling as if in an earthquake. This was not earthquake territory. Never had happened before. And lawns began to tilt. And Mike said, you know, I thought I was having a heart attack because I was suddenly shaking and waving on my way to the kitchen. And soon after that, little bubbles in the bayou being a river through a wet swamp-like area. And when I say the word swamp, I picture something magnificent with very rare birds and beautiful cypress trees. And so this methane gas seemed to be bubbling up. And in fact, in your own yard, there were bubbles that were like Alka-Seltzer tablets in the water puddle, in the rain puddles. Something terribly wrong. And people said, well, look, if you light a match and that's methane gas, we'll all blow up. And so there was an evacuation of 360 residents of Bayou Corn. And it was then revealed that there was a sinkhole. And that the sinkhole was kind of just like pulling a plug in your bathtub. Down went 100-foot tall and 100-year-old cypress trees, just sucked into a sinkhole. And much else, even a little boat went down. And in some terrible exchange, this methane gas saturated sludge came up. Started with an area the size of this where I am, and extended ruinously to 36 acres. Okay, what had caused this? Well, it turns out there was a company called Texas Brine, which drilled down beneath the floor of the bayou into an underlying salt formation called a salt dome, and had accidentally cracked the side of the salt dome. And it was that which was pulling the swampland down into it. And this company, what it does is go for brine, which is used in fracking, for example, and in making chlorine and many industrial products. So Texas Brine had been under-regulated. In fact, barely regulated at all. So when it had said, hey, do I have a permit to drill right here? There were geologists who the company had hired, said, actually, you're pretty close to that, the wall edge of that salt dome. I don't think you should, but the company disregarded that advice and drilled and caused this catastrophe. So, back to Mike. Mike had lost his community, his beloved community, but it wasn't because big government was the culprit. It was actually the absence of effective government that had lost him his community. And so I began to ask him, look, if this is true, if you've lost your community, not because of government, but because of the absence of it, tell me a little bit more about what you feel about the government. And it was like peeling the layers of an onion. And we went for fishing trips. It's the best way to interview people is on a fishing trip, because they can't leave the boat. And I just leave my tape recorder on. Very slow, no tough questions, but slow, Socratic approach. And his first feeling was, you know, I think of the federal government as the North. It's always, the North is always wagging its moral finger at the evil South, you know. Always the South is associated with slavery. We were bad, we were evil. And then came, you know, the carpetbaggers, and they poisoned the wells, and they set our fields afire. And then came, you know, the civil rights movement. I didn't tell him that my husband and I were among them in the state next door in the 60s. And then actually they see the environmentalists as saying, oh, you're wrecking your country like this. Okay, so that was one thing. He felt a kind of a regional affiliation. But you know, I give this very little, in the proportion of all the causality of that suspicion of the federal government. I don't think that was the main thing, and I think you find it in the Midwest too. But there was a second one. He said, well, you know, our state, these are bureaucrats, and they're not really doing their job. So government, it was an instrument of the North, and that was an instrument of do-nothing bureaucrats. Well, I learned that, in fact, he had a point, that the state Environmental Protection Agency was really captive to the oil industry. And what you had was Louisiana as an oil state, and the companies were basically outsourcing the moral dirty work to the state. So the state would pretend to protect people. You know, you paid tax money to keep them doing that, but they did not. They did not. And so he had a point there that, in fact, and if you look at that, at this second objection he had to government, you can kind of get into a way of feeling. If you looked at the companies, it looked like the companies were going to give you jobs, although it was very few jobs, because these are very automated plants, but still there was talk of jobs. And the state, under Governor Jindal, Bobby Jindal, had given these, a collection of companies $1.6 billion as incentive money to come to Louisiana instead of going to Texas. And with that money, the companies were very generous. They would give a donation to the Audubon Society, and they would make you know, T-shirts for LSU football players, and so they did goodwill things with that money. And so they were looking pretty good, jobs, donations. On the other hand, the state looked like it was taking your money and getting raises, all these members of the local EPA, and they weren't protecting you because Louisiana has, Calcasieu Parish, where I did focused a lot, was in the 2% most polluted areas, counties in the entire country. And Louisiana has the second highest death rate from cancer among men in the country. So look, if you're doing such a great job, why do we have all these terrible statistics? So that was the second reason. And you will notice that I put that in a kind of a lefty way by saying that industry had gotten the state to do the moral dirty work. Well, on our fishing expedition, I said, Mike, hey, this may not be quite how you think about it, but the way I think about it, I agree with you, the state isn't doing the job, but I think the ultimate culprit are the people who've paid so much money to basically buy the state. And he said, oh yeah, I think of it that way too. So there was a crossover. But he then said, and the federal government is a bigger, badder version of that local malfunctioning state. Okay, I would give a lot of weight to the second one, but it didn't seem like the main basic objection that the people I came to know over these 5 years really had to the federal government. And so the government seemed to this guy, Mike, like an instrument of something else, an instrument of what I came to think of as the line cutters in a deep story. Well, now what's a deep story? A deep story is a story of a situation as it feels. It's a story that feels true. So you take facts out of the deep story, you take moral judgments out of the deep story, you just have what feels true. I think we all have a deep story. I think there's, a left deep story and the right deep story. But I was interested in the right deep story. And it goes like this. You're headed up a hill, as in a pilgrimage. At the top of the hill is the American dream. And you're facing that dream, and the line has not moved. I interviewed people who hadn't gotten a raise in 2 decades. And so it hadn't moved. Your feet are tired. You feel a great sense of deserving for that prize at the top of the hill. You've waited a long time, you're rule-abiding, and you've hard worked. Many of these people had very short vacations, by the way. They were moving toward retirement, but Mike himself got 1 week of vacation in the entire year for the first 5 years of his latest place of work, which meant if he got a cold, he had no vacation. Loved to fish, loved hunting, couldn't get out there. Okay, so finally, there was a sense of, boy, I can't wait, as he's facing this American dream. And you don't have any malice, you feel, in this right-wing deep story toward anyone. It's just that you're waiting your turn. Then, in the second moment of the right-wing deep story, someone's cutting ahead. Not rule-abiding, just kind of cutting ahead of you, pushing you back a little bit. And who would that be, the line cutters? Well, it would be blacks who, through federally mandated affirmative action programs, now finally have access to jobs that historically had been reserved for whites. And then there would be women, even worse, because there are more of them, like me, who, through federally mandated affirmative action, now have access to jobs that were formerly reserved for men. And then you had immigrants without documents, and you had refugees. And even in their view, There was the oil-soaked brown pelican. This would be Louisiana's once endangered state bird. And it would be waddling up and breaking in ahead of people. People said, oh, the environmentalists put animals ahead of people. They care about birds and frogs, but not about us. And some people said, well, environmentalists are like animists. You know, they actually worship the bird instead of people. So all of these people are stepping ahead in line, cutting in line. And then a third moment in the right-wing deep story is Barack Obama, who is waving to the line cutters. Oh, he's their president. He's sponsoring them, but he's not sponsoring me. And in fact, isn't he a line cutter himself? Many people said, oh, how did his single mother, you know, she wasn't that wealthy, afford a Columbia higher education, a Harvard education? So, wait a minute, something fishy here. He's a line cutter too. He's disobeying kind of the rules. So then there's a moment in which the people standing in line, feet tired on moving line, feel pushed back by the line cutters and feel a moment of estrangement that, wait a minute, we don't have a president that is helping people like me. In fact, aren't I part of a minority group that hasn't been named or recognized? And you know, are we a different nation or what? Why aren't we being represented? Didn't feel seen, didn't feel acknowledged. And then in the final moment of the deep story, someone ahead of you in line, more educated, more coastal, more professional, turns around and says, you backward, prejudiced, Southern, Bible-thumping, fiction-believing a person, you redneck. And that was the tipping point, redneck. You know, we are now a dishonored person who's really been morally voted out of a democracy. And there was a sense you have in this moment of being in an honor squeeze. How can you get honor? It's something we all crave. I think it represents kind of parental, maternal love, to feel honored. And so you're looking for honor. You're not getting it from work. People didn't tell me, oh, I'm a proud pipe fitter. They would say, I work for PPG. You know, they'd tell you the company, but not the actual work. And they were proud of working a lot, but not necessarily fitting into a function they believed in. These were tough companies to work for. And so you can't get honor from work. Then maybe you can get it because you're a deacon in the Pentecostal church. Well, no, the rest of society, and they know how the rest of society has seen them, sees kind of evangelicals as backward. They said, well, we can't say Merry Christmas anymore. We have to say Happy Holidays. You know, like a holiday card, even just happy. You know, the West Coast has kind of cut down the meaning of ritual. So you can't really take pride that you might want to in being religious. Your social values, family values, those two seem backward to the society and to the Supreme Court. So you couldn't make claims for honor on the basis of that. And even as a region, the South was seen as a kind of backward region. I think the Midwest feels the same. Well, you know, just farmers and hay seeds. And social class prejudice, I think, actually is there and underlies everything I'm saying. So there's a sense in which you're in this honor squeeze and waiting and being, as you feel, pushed back. A minority group without a claim for recognition put forward. So in the end, they felt we need something else. At the very end of my research, Donald Trump sailed high from the sky down to the New Orleans airport. And there were strobe lights, red, white, and blue. This was his primary. It was in March. Rally. Thousands of people came with their Trump hats, and Rocket Man was playing loud and blaring, and a sense of great excitement. And I felt when I saw this excitement, and people were pumping their signs up and down, "Make America Great Again," that I had been studying for 5 years the dry kindling. And then I saw the match. I will give you your America back again. And it was almost too, I had a feeling, like for many of these evangelicals believed in the rapture. There come a moment when the earth comes to an end and the damned will go down and the elect will go up, good people go up. And I almost felt like, as he came down from the sky, that this was a secular rapture moment. That you would get your American dream. He would magically give it to you by reversing history. And in one fell swoop, in one proud pronouncement. And and I actually did see a man holding up a sign saying, Jesus has brought him to us, capital H. So in a way, I'm coming to the end here in order to open out questions. But in the end, I felt that it wasn't the red state paradox I was really looking at. It was the blue state paradox I was looking at. Why is it that the Democratic Party, the party of the working man and the working woman, had lost all the people I had came to meet? They did not see anything for them in the Democratic platform. There were some things, I think, but they didn't see them. It wasn't offered on a tray that they could see and hear the recognition of themselves. And so I think that's the one that's on our plate. And I've talked to a lot of people who said, well, gosh, they're not that curious about us. When it's us, they go and find out about them. I think we should just wait here until they come to us. And I'm here to invite you to another conclusion. It may be our time to formulate a response. And here I'm going to draw from a conversation I had with Martin over here, who suggested that what we really need is a loyal opposition. And I see this opposition as having 3 pillars of activism. And the third pillar, I think, involves getting out and getting to know people like the ones I met. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Very much, Arlie. We're now going to open up for about half an hour of questions. Do you hear hear me? Yeah. Great. And I will be calling on questioners, and Liz, who's up front here, is going to be our runner and bringing the microphone to your seat, so you don't have to leave where you're sitting to ask a question. And if it's needed, if you don't hear well enough, if you just put your hands up, then Arlie or I will repeat the question. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you to please restrict your remarks to a brief question so that we will have time for as many of your questions as we possibly can. And please begin with your name and any identifying yourself that you'd like us to know. So, who's going to be the first question? In the way back, on my right. Yeah, Yuri.
My name is Patricia Silver. I am a member of Ashby Village. But all very true. What you didn't answer for me was, why did they vote against their self-interest? How come they believed in the Republicans? And how come they didn't get what I got, which is that man did not pay his workers?
Okay, did you hear that?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. How could it be that these people did not follow their own economic interests? And they were, in a sense, hoodwinked, and that I haven't explained that. Okay. Well, something else was more important to them, I think, is the first way to put it. They felt that the whole, culturally as well as economically marginalized. And that involved at the bottom a sense of dignity, pride. It was their emotional self-interest. And remember, this is fed by Fox News every day, because Fox News is a deep story television and radio program. And they just felt insulted by the Democrats, basically, and Hillary. So I think we have to look beyond economic interest at emotional interest. And it isn't just the fact that Donald Trump didn't pay his workers that they're overlooking. These are profoundly kind of religious and morally upright people, and he also imitated disabled reporter, as you know, and he's talked about reaching for women's crotches with impunity. I mean, they've overlooked a lot, and from my point, we know that, but they know that. They know that too. And to me, the answer is that they feel that desperate. They feel that desperate that they will overlook all of these other things. It's not that they're stupid. It's not that they're not capable of ambivalence and nuance. They're just as smart as you and I. But something else was bigger for them. And it was basic. They feel like a civil war is due. And so it tells us how strongly they feel that they overlooked these things.
Next question over on that side. Yeah.
I have two questions. I'm Hillary Bendick. I'm a member and a volunteer. One.
Use the mic.
Here.
Two questions. One, do you have any sense of their reaction since the election? What do they think? And two, can you tell us something about your meeting with the Democrats?
Okay. Yeah. Yes, I've been back to Louisiana 3 times since the book was published. The first time was I had sent them copies of the book, and then I gave them 2 weeks to read it, and and some funny things about that. And then I put on dinners for them and asked them how, did I get it right? Yeah, they said, yeah, you put what I felt down. And yeah, but then there were factual things, which you'll see corrected in the paperback edition. One woman came to the dinner and she had on a jacket like this and then a red t-shirt. And she had a twinkle in her eye, and she came up and said, you want to see my t-shirt? I said, yeah. And it said, adorable deplorables. And then she said, I'm going to send you one. But you got to wear it. So they are. And then I've been twice back. In addition to that, one I can tell you about was an effort to get my son and this Mike together. Can there be common ground on preventing another Bayou Corn sinkhole? You know, should there be one ever again in the United States? How can we get there? So we went fishing again. I said, I'm just going to hold the tape recorder, but my son happens to be a member of the 5-person Energy Commission of California with a large staff, which Mike wouldn't like, you know, 500 people. And he's in charge of renewable energy. So I thought, oh, these people could not be more opposite. But they had met, they liked each other, and there was common ground. So they are forgiving a lot. They will continue to forgive, I think, a lot. I believe it will not be true that when the news is revealed that Donald Trump cannot single-handedly reverse all the forces of globalization, the scales will not fall from their eyes. They won't get it, oh God. No, I think it won't happen automatically, but what I do believe is that the Democratic Party needs to get a new platform there, a new kind of culture of respect. The Democrats should be wrap themselves, I think, in the American flag. We stand for respectful conversation. We stand for democracy, and we stand for decency, and we also stand for some things for recognizing who you are. So I don't think, unless that happens, that we're going to see the scales drop from their eyes. I have other things on that, but that's thought. Then second one, you asked about the House Democratic Party. At this session, it was a plenary session, I was one of 3 speakers, and there were 140 of the 190 Democrats left in the House. A lot of them were women and blacks, not a lot of white men, interesting. And I wasn't sure they got it, in fact. No, I didn't get that feeling. I mean, some of them came up and made speeches, you know, instead of questions, not a good sign. And another guy got up and said, well, look, we just have to wait. The demographics are with us. Young people are more liberal. Let's just wait until old people die off, and the whole place will become more liberal. Just wait. I mean, in essence, we have the demographic card, which I don't think is at all a good sign for the Civil War and the struggle we're in the middle of for the soul of our country.
Next question, Merle.
How would you briefly characterize the deep story of those of us sitting here, the liberals?
Yeah.
Briefly, even.
Yeah. Yes, how would I characterize the liberal deep story?
Yes.
We're all ranged around a giant public square. Okay, and we're all facing it. And within this public square, there is a state-of-the-art, creative children's science museum, open long hours with friendly docents that show you how to do things. A child of any color, of any income level can come and enjoy it. Next to it is a library that's open all hours, and inside it is for little 3-year-olds, you know, goodbye, good night moon. Okay, well, each page, you know, is an illustration on the walls of this library. And there are schools that are, again, the pride of America. And there are nature reserves. Okay, and then, the second moment of the liberal deep story, someone comes from outside this public square and with a steam shovel and gouges out kind of the concrete at the bottom of this state-of-the-art children's science museum, wrecking it, and takes the soil and the concrete, and behind the backs of everybody in the public square, starts to build a McMansion, kind of a 1% kind of thing. The very rich will have their own money. It's now privatized, and now in that game, you have to be rich to have the good things of the earth. And shattered, feeling, in fact, like marauders had destroyed something, point of such pride, people are upset. It's what set me on my journey.
Person in the back towards the window, yeah.
My name is Marcel. I'm the son-in-law of an Ashby Village member. Thank you. To me, your deep explanation of the line cutters sounds like a emotional explanation of what has been called scapegoating. And scapegoating has been a successful tactic used by many different governments, many different dictatorships across time. I'd like to ask you whether you agree with that, and if people have internalized the scapegoating and believe it, do you really think that Democratic Party platforms and policies can actually change that feeling of scapegoating, or how can we address it?
Great question. Yes, I agree with what you're saying, and recall that a deep story is a story how it feels. It doesn't have facts in it. Right? You've taken facts out. You've taken history out. A deep story is really a story of distortion. Theirs and ours, I think, have distortion. I believe theirs has much more distortion. And so yes, racism, sexism, class, these are part of the deep story, and they're part of the distortion. But how are we going to deal with them? Does it then make it impossible? I mean, I think here is where it's important to, I think, disaggregate 3 pillars of activism from one another. And you can be one person, you don't have to do all 3 at the same time. But I think I'm a little bit repeating myself, but it's important, so I will. The first is to face Donald Trump and his surrogates and hold up the importance of the principle of checks and balances, an independent press, an independent judiciary. And you just face those policies and support the groups, become part of the groups that push those policies forward. The second is retooling the Democratic Party and its platform and face forward for that one. But the third one is reaching back, not in hopes of enormous shifts in this group, but in hopes of softening the divide And softening feels very important to me. You know what I'd really love to see? I really would love to see every high school senior in the United States have 2 weeks with a family that lives in a different region. Get a host family so that you have coastal kids spending 2 weeks with inland farming families, and farming families spending 2 weeks with coastal kids. You have northern kids that come south for 2 weeks, and you have southern kids that go north, and each one collect the story of the people you have gone to. What would that do? Is that just pie in the sky, sort of pretty picture? No, I think it's a deeper, more important part of this three-part, kind of three-pillar approach, which should be coordinated, as in a kind of a loyal opposition. What it would do, I think, is mitigate what I am most afraid of. I began by saying we're in enclaves. We're in geographical and media enclaves and electronic enclaves. Donald Trump is exacerbating that issue. He is saying that the mass media is an enemy of the American people, and he is tweeting, doing an end run around the mass media to his base. And how do we address this? I actually don't know. I want to collect ideas as I go around giving talks. I would be interested in your best thought on that. But one thing I think really will help, which is to have people across this divide begin to talk to each other and reveal what sources of information are. Sensitize people. You don't say, oh, you're wrong. You know, there is global warming. You say, where did you hear that? Huh. And are there other sources of information on that? Let's check. Let's do it together. It would, I think, begin to mitigate the power that Donald Trump has over these people. Because I also discovered a lot of paranoia among the people that I came to know. And paranoia is something that is much stronger among people that feel powerless and are less educated. And that is this constituency. So that's what I'd like to see.
Okay, next question, Joe.
Two things you haven't mentioned at all are immigration. My name is Joan Stromanis, and I'm a volunteer for Ashby Village. You haven't mentioned immigration, and you haven't mentioned Islam and the threat of terrorism.
Yeah.
I actually have regular conversations, maybe once or twice a week, with my Republican son-in-law, who doesn't feel insulted by Democrats. His wife is one. But he is afraid of Muslims. Mm-hmm. And he believes that people want to come into our country and kill us, and that Donald Trump is the only person who can prevent that. So I'm just representing a different kind of Trump supporter, and I'm wondering if you encountered that person or people like that, and what do the people you talk to say about terrorism and immigration?
Yes, it's a wonderful question. They, too, are very afraid of Muslims. They put all kinds of Muslims together with Sharia law, which they feel is alien and dangerous. And in the state of Louisiana, I think it's 1.5% of the population are Muslim. But this fills their conversation, their Fox News drenched conversation, you know, as if half the population were Muslim. And then I heard people say, I said, are there any Muslims? Do you know any Muslims? Well, no, but at that Esso station, that's a Lebanese guy that's selling gas. And what if they all decided that they wouldn't give us, sell us any gas? We couldn't get to work. So, and also the candy concessions, well, they're in cahoots with other Lebanese family members, and you couldn't, get a job selling candy at his gas station. So there was clannish and dangerous. About Mexican immigrants, it was undocumented workers. There was a lot of respect. These people work hard. These people don't have vacations. They work as hard as we do. So there was actually a little tacit, nod of respect, and I think a little more flexibility on the issue of undocumented workers than there is on Muslims, paradoxically, yeah.
Way over on the side, that's you. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Catherine Sklar. I'm a historian. My question is about, thank you. My question is about voting and the degree to which your friends in Lake Charles were aware of their districts and changes that might have occurred due to gerrymandering, and whether they participated at a grassroots level in politics.
Yes, no, they weren't. They thought that the Democrats were the gerrymandering ones, and they wanted to accumulate more votes, so it wouldn't bother them if they did focus on it. And voting was something they were very active. They were organized. That's what we have to learn here. These Tea Party people. Oh my goodness, these Republican women of Southwest Louisiana, there were like, 40, 50, 60 people, every month, and they got there early, and they had, 6 or 7 different clubs, and at one time there were, teenagers who were like proto-Tea Party people, and they all wear, red shirts and a certain table. They're very organized. And they would say, well, you need a photo ID. Everybody has a photo ID. If you work, don't you need a photo ID? So the people who are claiming they want to vote who don't have a photo ID, well, then they must not be working. That was the rhetoric you got. Yeah.
Peter?
I'm Peter Sussman, and I had 2 questions, one on the Democrats, one on the Republicans. On the Democratic side, all of us, our inboxes are flooded with groups, old and new, ad hoc. Who's doing it right? Who's doing it right in the Democratic Party as far as reaching the core emotional constituency you're talking about? The other question is on the Republicans. There are really 2, if not more, Republican parties in an uneasy alliance, one more corporate and one more,
That's right.
if you will, populist,
Yes.
the Tea Party. How are they dealing with the strain of being in control and appealing to the storyline that's written for them by the people who won the election, the more populist brand, I think.
So the second question had to do with how do they relate to the split in the Republican Party, and the first, sorry.
Yeah, the first was the Democratic Party, and who's doing it right?
Okay, yeah. I don't know who's doing it right, but what I do have is a collection of good ideas, what I feel are good ideas, that I have gathered as I've been giving talks, and I'm giving a lot of talks. I'm happy to be doing this. So I can give this handout to Joan and make it available. But in that, in which I talk about the 3 pillars, of activism. I think that Indivisible is one of those groups. I think that MoveOn.org is another. In New York, the Working Family Party is doing good work. But I do feel like whichever is doing the best, we need to coordinate across groups. It's good to plug in where we care the most and can be the most effective, but then we have to look sideways at what other groups are doing and make sure we become part of that. I'm going to say something else, and this will be a little bit disturbing. If my whole talk hasn't been disturbing. And that is that from their point of view, it's liberals who are the violent ones. They saw this band, I think, of anarchists. I don't know if it was their crazies or our crazies, but I think they were our crazies who both on UC campus and later when there was a pro-Trump rally, some people all dressed in black and came in a very organized way. And one young man kind of just socked a Trump follower in the face. His face was bloodied. He may have broken a nose. And that photograph went around the world, and it went certainly around recycling around the social circles of the people I came to know. And they then, so when I would say, no, this guy Trump is really scary, he's shutting down every voice but his own, we've seen that before, fascism, that word. And he said, oh no, your side is the fascist side. Your brown shirts. And I thought, okay, how do we get out of this one? Partly, I think it is by confronting such people that claim to represent us. I do not believe they do represent us. And that's fed into this little paranoid cycle that I was. Now, what was your second? I'm sorry, I keep.
No, it's the Republicans. They have an evident split.
Yeah, oh yeah.
More corporate, more.
Thank you,
Yeah.
thank you. Oh, they did not relate at all to the corporate, a mainstream Democratic Party. What was fascinating is how they related to Bernie. Like Mike Sky said, oh, Uncle Bernie, he's pie in the sky. He's a socialist, but we're a capitalist society, and he's promising free education for everyone. But he's Uncle Bernie, very friendly. And I ran into that. It was a kind of they related to what I had thought was a completely opposite kind of philosophy. Interesting, yeah.
We have actually only time for one more question, but there are lots of other questions I know, so we're going to be spending some time together outside, and I hope the questioning will go on. The one last question over, yeah.
Not fair. Not fair.
I'll be around.
Well, I'm not used to going around quoting the Buddha, but I would draw your attention to the Buddha over here. All that we are is the result of what we have thought. And this is a plea, I think, that we need to do is to pay attention to the media. We have a president who is a master at manipulating the media. And if we don't win that war, right, if you will, and I call it a war because that's what it is. And how do I talk to the miner who's been promised his job back, to the steel worker in Pennsylvania, and to the American public? Mm-hmm. I see what our job is, and that what you have said about this particular community Can you transport that, do you think, to other communities?
Oh, definitely. You know, if you were, you know, just going back to that crossover moment with Mike and my son David, Mike was the one to say, you know, we're running out of oil. You know, we really do need renewables. And David said, well, funny thing, I'm the renewable guy. And David had a different fact that Mike didn't know, which is that you already have more people employed with just solar itself than our coal miners. More people at an average wage of $26 an hour. Well, now that's a fact you're not going to hear, you know, on Fox News. And you're right to focus on these points of information, but we need to arm ourselves with information in our conversations across the line.
Well,